Good morning. This is Sunday, October 25th, and we're so happy to be able to make contact with you again by YouTube. There's been a lot of going on in the past couple of weeks with the virus and people being sick and down and quarantined, and we suspended our services till after the 1st of November. And I think that's wise, just to give us time for our people to recover as much as possible and slow it down. Also, in just a couple of weeks, less than a week, 2 weeks, you'll be going to the polls to vote, and I'd encourage you to do that. That's a right and a privilege we have as citizens of the United States to go to the polls and voice our convictions and what we feel is right in the right direction for our country. And you have that right and you have that responsibility to do that. So please, if you haven't already voted, there's many ways you can go in McCracken County to the courthouse and vote. You can vote on election day in person, ever how you choose at this time, however you want to go. It'll be fine, just as long as you exercise your right and make your voice heard in our nation. So I just ask you to pray about it, and if you haven't already voted, please do so. Now, we've been dealing with several different subjects and topics over the past weeks while we've been quarantined, and while we've had people out and services suspended. And today I want to talk about the bottom of the barrel. Have you ever felt like you was just at the bottom of your barrel? Your barrel was empty. You were scraping up what was left over. Well, there's an instance in the book of 1 Kings chapter 17 where a widow lady came to the bottom of her barrel. Now, just for a little background, this is one of my favorite sections of the Bible dealing with Elijah. You know, Elijah was that prophet that was brave enough to go in right in front of the king and say, "It's not going to rain till I say so." And there's 3.5 years of drought, no rain, no dew. Can you imagine how dry it was? And in the end, you remember, he comes back and calls the false prophets of Baal to Mount Carmel and has a showdown that the God answers by fire is God. But in between that, Elijah had some tough times too. Sometimes we think, well, if you do right, you never have tough times. Not doing right sometimes brings tough times. Elijah had gone into the king, very brave, very bold, and made a statement that God had told him, a statement based on Scripture. And he said, God's going to shut up the heavens, and it's not going to rain until I say it is. Now, that's a bold statement, isn't it? Well, he walked out, and I'm sure they all shook their heads and said, well, what a conceited, deluded prophet that is, to think that he can stop the rain. Well, it went a month, 2 months. It went 3.5 years. But in the meantime, Elijah was taken to a brook at Kerith, and there he just sat down by the brook, and God had running water for him, plenty of water, shade, and he had his meals flown in by the ravens, by the buzzards. I don't know. I'd rather have my food delivered some way but buzzards, but I guess if that's the best you got, that's not bad. At least he had in-home delivery. But then his brook dried up. Now what's he going to do? Well, God sends him to a widow's house in Zarephath. And he gets there and he finds a widow with just enough food for one last meal for her and her son. Now let me read you that story in 1 Kings 17, beginning in verse 8. Then the word of the Lord came to him, "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there." Now remember, his brook had dried up at Kidron, so he's having to move. "Behold, I will command the widow there to feed you." He said, "I'm going to tell that widow woman to feed you. So he arose and went to Zarephath, and when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, "Bring me a little water in a vessel that I may drink." Now, here he is. He's approaching a widow lady who's out gathering up some sticks, and the first thing out of his mouth is, "Bring me a little water that I might drink." Now, you'd say that's a very simple request. Water? Not in that day, because there was a drought on. And the brooks had dried up where he was, and now, he's going to a widow who doesn't have the resources that he had maybe, and he says, I want a drink. And as she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. He said, not only do I want a drink of water, I want something to eat. I want some bread. And she said, oh, as the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I've got just a little oil and a little flour. And now I'm gathering a couple of sticks that I may go and prepare it for myself and my son that we may eat and die. She said, got enough for one last meal for me and my son. I'm getting some sticks to build a fire. I'm going to bake the bread, and we're going to eat, and then we'll die because we'll starve to death. And Elijah said to her, do not fear. Go and do as you have said. But first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me. And afterward make something for yourself and your son. You say, how selfish. Bake me a cake first and then cook for you and your son with the leftovers. Selfish sounding, isn't it? For thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth. And he said, if you'll do this, if you'll obey God, you'll have plenty of flour and plenty of oil as long as the drought lasts. What a promise. What a promise. She knew what she had, just enough for a meal for her and her son, and now the prophet wants part of it. But he says, listen, if you'll do what I tell you, you won't go hungry. You won't do without as long as the drought lasts. And she went and did it, Elijah said. Now, here's one that listened to the voice of the prophet, the preacher. It's amazing when we listen to truth. And she said, and he and her household ate for many days. He ate for a lot of days. The jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. Now, you see, she was at the bottom of the barrel, the bottom of the jar, whatever you want to call it. Just enough flour and oil for one meal. She's going to eat it and die. Have you ever been to the bottom of the barrel in your life? I mean, have you? Everything's dark, everything's hopeless. No one offers any help, and if they do, it's in a condemning tone. If you'd have taken better care of yourself, if you'd have provided more, if you'd have saved up more, then you wouldn't be in this mess now. You ever been there? You ever experienced that? Have you ever reached up to touch the bottom? You say, man, I'm below the bottom of the barrel. I've got to reach up just to touch the bottom. Have you ever been to the bottom of the barrel in your life? Some of you have. And some of you are going through it right now in the midst of this pandemic. You're about the bottom of the barrel. You're wondering where your next meal might come from. Have you ever been tempted to fear, to be afraid? Elijah said to her, do not fear. Go and do as you have said, but first make me a little cake and bring it to me, and afterward make something for yourself and your son. He said, don't be afraid. Fear is a very real emotion that we all deal with. We're afraid of different things. Jesus said many times to his followers, don't be afraid. Why did he just keep saying don't be afraid? Because we have a tendency to be afraid. It's our human nature to fear. Why did he say that to them? Because he knew they'd be tempted to be afraid. The devil likes to put us in fear, drive us in a corner, behind closed doors, afraid to stick our head out. Fear is a great enemy, but John said perfect love casts out fear. Perfect love dispels fear. The love of God can dispel it. And here's a woman who loved God enough to listen to the prophet of God, and God dispelled her fears. Have you ever been tempted to be scared? Have you ever been scared? Now, we all have different fears, and we have all struggle with fear and scares in life. I mean, maybe it's health. Health is a very big issue right now with COVID, isn't it? People are afraid. Now, I'm not advocating that we not be cautious. I'm not advocating that we go against all advice and counsel, whether we agree with it or not. That's not the point. But we don't live in fear. You see, when we live in fear, we're not trusting God. Now, you say, you mean then I just ought to go out and not take any precautions? God never taught that. I'm not saying that. But we don't cower in fear and let it stop us from talking to God, meeting with God, sharing with God, asking of God, experiencing God, and doing the natural things of life that we must do. I mean, there's cancer. That's a health scare. We all hate that dreaded word and fear it. You know, the word cancer, the heart. When you have issues with the heart, you've got a major problem because you've got to have that heart pumping the blood. Maybe the mind. You think, I'm losing my mind. My memory's fading. These are legitimate emotions. What about your job? Not sure you'll have one. Not sure you do have one. That's real today, isn't it? What about your children? We worry about our children. They'll pick the right mate in life. They'll pick the right profession in life. They'll have good health. They'll have a good job. And they'll live for God. Some are struggling with marriage. Is my marriage going to survive these days? Fear. You ever been tempted to be afraid? Have you ever been scared? Okay, yes we have. I have, you have. So what do we do when we're scared? We withdraw and think no one cares, but it's our fault. We feel sorry for ourselves and we get depressed. Here, now notice the difference in the widow. She didn't just go in and shut the door and say to her son, well, we're going to die. It doesn't matter what we do. We're going to die. We can't live another day. Here's enough food for one meal, and we're going to die. Might as well just shut the door, forget the world, and just sit here and quiet until the inevitable comes. No. Now, she was realistic that she didn't have enough flour and oil to last more than one more meal. And I'm sure scare had entered her fear. What am I going to do? But she said, I'm going to do what I know to do until the end comes. So what was she doing? She was out picking up sticks. That's what verse 10 said when Elijah saw the widow was out picking up sticks. What was she going to do with those sticks? She was going to build a fire. What was she going to do with the fire? She was going to bake the last bit of meal and oil she had into bread that they might eat. She is doing what she knew to do today and trusting God for tomorrow. That's what Jesus said to his disciples. Trust God for tomorrow. Think not about tomorrow. Work today. Trust me today. Serve me today. Keep doing what you know is God's plan. People say, well, I don't know what God wants. I don't know. Well, no, do what you know he wants. Keep doing what you know until God reveals something else. And here the woman was doing everything she knew to do. And then God revealed something else. Bake a cake for the prophet. And she moved on. You know, wouldn't it have been very easy for her when Elijah approached her in the shape she was in to say, don't bother me with a sermon. Don't bother me with your troubles. Don't take my last bit of water. Don't take my last bit of meal and oil. She didn't tell Elijah to go away. She listened. She voluntarily sat down and listened. She did what she was told to do. Elijah said, look, I know your circumstances. God does too. God sent me here and said he'd provide. So you go in there and you bake for me a little cake and then one for each you and your son and eat. And we'll have flour and oil throughout the drought. So what'd she do? Say, that's not possible. If I take all the flour out, how's there going to be more flour in the jar, in the barrel? I'm at the bottom, don't you understand? I'm at the bottom, prophet. I've scraped it dry. No, she just did what she was told. Do you realize how much stress, how much pain, how much anguish, how much fear it would take out of our lives if we just did what God told us to do when he tells us? Not argue with him? Go to others. Give to others. Be a help and encouragement to others. So, bottom of the barrel. We've been there. We've been tempted to fear. We've been afraid. But I don't read fear in this widow's voice, do you? I read trust of God. She wasn't moaning and groaning about how bad they were. She said, here's the facts. The fact is, all I've got is enough for one meal, and we'll eat it. And then I said, well, we're going to die. Well, trials refine us to make us more like Jesus. Here's what Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 6. In this rejoice, though now for a little time, while if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials. He said, rejoice, even though for a little time you've had some serious trials. Some of you have gone through some serious trials lately. Why? So that the tested genuineness of your faith, that your faith might be tested to prove it's real, that is more precious than gold that perishes, though it be tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. He said, here you are. You're being tried. You're being tested by various trials. And today some of you are going through some great trials. And it may be some of those things we mentioned, from health to finances to job to children to your marriage to where the next meal's coming from. He said trials come to test our faith. As a believer now, I'm talking about as believers, as Christians, trials test our faith. We're like a full sponge, and trials come and wring us out so that we can take in more and better. Think of that. Just mark that down. Trials come as we're like filled up sponges, can't soak up anymore, and it wrings us dry so we can take in some fresh and new that's more and better. We need to wring out the sponge of our lives every day so we can take in more. You see, you picture a full sponge dripping, and you can't take any more water in it. That sponge is full. It's dripping now. Wring it out, and what happens? You can fill it up again. That's what happens when we come to church. Sometimes we come to church on Sunday, we're like a wrung out sponge. Some of you listening, you're like a sponge that's been wringed out this week. The world has squeezed us dry, and we need to fill up again. Wring it out so God can refill it. Here's a woman, her sponge had been wrung out. All was out. Everything was gone. She was at the bottom of the barrel. There was no more after that meal. And God did a wonderful thing. How full is your life with things that aren't important or needful? See, we fill up our sponge with unimportant, unneedful things. And God wrings us out in His time and His way. He wrung Elijah out several times, or testing him, that he might trust Him more. He wrung this widow out. She might trust Him. Man, when the prophet said, bake me a little cake and then one for you and your son, that emptied her. There wasn't nothing left. I mean, she was dried out. Are you at the bottom of the barrel in your life? Trust God's sufficiency. God knows our problem, and God is the source of all of our resources. The widow and her son never went hungry. Now, they may not have had a high-class meal in a nice restaurant, but we're not going to die if we don't do that. We can find food, enough food to live another day, another day, another day. And the barrel will not be empty. And I'm not talking about physical food. I'm talking about spiritual. God can supply the physical as He did here. He did for her every day because she obeyed Him. We've got a better chance of being taken care of by God by obeying Him than we have disobeying Him. Would you not agree with that?